This week's guest on That's Business is Hugh Marks, the Managing Director of the ABC. Now, this is a business podcast, and the ABC isn't strictly a business, although the letters do stand for Australian Broadcasting Corporation. But Hugh Marks is definitely a business person, having spent 30 years in commercial TV, most recently as CEO of the Nine Network, including, thanks to him, the Fairfax newspapers and radio stations. So in this interview, we ask Hugh Marks about the future of traditional media, and specifically commercial businesses like Nine that he's just come from. And of course, we get to what he's doing with the ABC. How's he going to reshape it? Is he having to correct mistakes from the past at the ABC? And did he go in too hard with the staff recently, leading to a 24-hour strike? Did the ABC make a mistake not buying Bluey? And does it really need to have a show like Married at First Sight in order to make some money and supplement the money it gets from the government? All this and more from Hugh Marks, the Managing Director of the ABC. Well, good day, boss. Hugh Marks, thanks for joining That's Business.
Good day, Alan. How are you going?
Very well. Great to talk to you. Now, let's get going. Now, one of the biggest kind of running criticisms of the media generally is that it's no longer trustworthy. And people getting their news from all sorts of sources now, some of them not that trustworthy either, and some of them nefarious in their intent. So, but do you think the media has got some blame attached to this, that really we've kind of dropped the ball a bit?
Oh, look, I think the media across the whole spectrum does actually a really good job of presenting information that's accurate, that's fair, that's relatively impartial. Obviously, there will always be examples that people will hold out that's different to that. But I think if you consume, a lot of media, I think you do get a very good service. So I don't know that's warranted. I guess it comes from a notion, and what's happening at the moment is just, particularly through social platforms, the rise of partial media. Those platforms tend to push you into environments that sort of reinforce your views or your perspectives, and that reinforcing function sometimes means that your views are hardened, and then your view of what's impartial, I guess, changes. So I think there's a bunch of things happening at the same time. But my assessment generally of the overall scope of media is as long as you go into it and consume enough, that you will get a very good service.
I guess what you're talking about there to some extent is the rise of algorithms, and they've been a big deal, haven't they?
Yeah, algorithms feed into division. That's, division creates fandom, and all of those social platforms are fandom environments. You connect with things that really are reflective of your own views and circumstances. So, algorithms just reinforce that. That's the way they operate. So what that does sort of demonstrate is the importance of traditional media, is the importance of public broadcasting like ABC and SBS. We have a set of standards, and we have processes for complaints, and there's checks and balances, and I think that's a really great system. So, in an environment where social media, and yes, there's a rise of consumption in those places, but that is a more divisive sort of self-reinforcement environment. The existence of traditional media and our responsibilities are more important than they ever were.
So you came from Channel 9, and now you're running the ABC. But now that you're out of commercial TV, you can tell us what you really think about their prospects. What about it?
Well, I think TV is actually a really good business. I think there are, as you would know, and I can talk about this in a business podcast. You've got to focus on both lines, the cost line and the revenue line, and I guess the profit line being the ultimate arbiter of success. But I think with television, there is a shift of viewing to an on-demand environment away from linear channels. That has consequences for how you think about the television business. But provided you embrace that shift and you commission the content that's going to work in those various environments, then actually what happens is every audience member who's in an on-demand environment is actually more valuable than one in a linear environment. So for television, actually, that transition, if you can manage your content transition, it actually makes it a really good business for the future. Part of the issue has been we're still, and the businesses are still competing in a legacy space. So they're still bidding up rights for sports and other things, which makes sense, right? Because of the certainty of it. But unfortunately, those things aren't the future of media. They're sort of the past legacy business. So they need to manage that transition so they can spend more on the content that's going to work in that multi-platform environment where you can make more money from advertising on demand environment rather than overspending on the legacy side. And they're still messing around with that transition, but over time, if they get that right, television should be a good business. And if you look at even the big tech platforms, you look at Spotify, you look at Apple, obviously YouTube is the biggest, growing platform in the world. They're all video-based platforms. So there's all potential for video-based organizations to play in those spaces. So I think television's good. I think radio has more challenges, just because the advertising environment.
Partly because of what we're doing, right?
A little bit, yeah, correct. But also just on a business basis, the advertising environment in on-demand is not as attractive as the advertising environment in linear. So with that shift of on-demand, that actually means radio's got greater challenges than television. But provided they can control their cost line, I've seen the stats, viewing is increasing in television, so they should be able to grow revenue. And if they can manage the cost line, they should be able to grow profitability.
But isn't the TV challenge really fundamentally about competition? I mean, it used to be commercial TV generally, it used to be a sort of a cartel where they there was just a few channels on terrestrial broadcasting. But now everyone's watching TV via apps. And when you open up the TV, there's this whole row of apps, and Channel 9 and 7 and 10 are just three of them. So the fundamental proposition has changed, hasn't it?
It has, but increasingly, if you look at Netflix or Amazon or digital, they will be an internationally focused operation. Yes, they'll have great programs as they do at the moment, and that will continue. Although you already see some consolidation in those apps, right? So there's already consolidation happening at the global level. So on a domestic basis, it's really just a challenge to commission the right content so your own apps in that space can get an increased share of viewing. So again, if I look at the data, you see growth of viewing across, those two platforms for our television companies. So when there's growth, there should be growth in revenue. As long as they can control the cost line, they should be able to grow profitability, and they should be able to compete in that space by focusing, on the local, to supplement the international and just accept that competition. So again, viewing totally is going up. And so provided they can get growth in viewing, they should be able to grow revenue and profits.
But a lot of the viewing that's going on now is short videos on the phone, TikTok and Instagram and so on. And that seems to be what's being consumed, as opposed to sitting in a lounge, sitting on a sofa watching TV. So how is that going to affect things? Because it's clearly growing.
Yeah, so you've got to have a long form ad product and you've got to have a short form ad product, and they need to lean into the short form, which I know they are in many ways, particularly with their bigger hits. So, if you look at Married at First Sight, which yes, I have the dubious honor of having started that at Channel 9. And you look at the viewing of that program across all of the platforms, short form, long form. Now it's on Stan in a subscription environment. And you think about the revenue growth from that show. Like the revenue growth from that show is extraordinary. Whereas you look at the midday movie or the show that may be played at 10:30 at night on Channel 9, the revenue for that is dropping in free fall. So they've got to go through this revenue transition and make sure they're investing in the content that can play across short form, long form, free and paid. And if they get that right, those businesses should be okay. I'm not saying it's easy, but no business is easy. They can all go through that transition.
And what about news, both TV and radio? I mean, people now say that they don't consume much news anymore. It's too depressing, biased, boring. I mean, do you think there's always going to be a place for TV news bulletins in particular?
Yeah, I think, television news, and I see it in the case of the ABC. We're doing, I think, 1.2 million hours of viewing of our news content on YouTube alone every week. So, we are a big player in what that, viewing is in those digital platforms. And we have to be. That's a responsibility of the ABC to meet audiences in the platforms they're choosing to consume content. It's harder for the commercial businesses to do that because, the revenue proposition for them in social is not as good as it is. They get 100% of it when it's on their own platform, and they get a share of it when it's through YouTube.
Well, that's really what I'm talking about. I mean, sure, the ABC's fine; it gets money from the government, but the commercials, they need to get revenue, and it's a whole different proposition on social.
They do, but it will still be part of the mix of their content offering going forward. Again, their content proposition just needs to change to reflect where the revenue opportunities are, and they just need to control the cost base. So, news will remain a part of it because news is, people might not recognize they're consuming news when they're on YouTube or Instagram or Facebook, but news is there and they're being served with ads as part of it. So there is an advertising environment there. So it's not all doom and gloom. It's just a transition. And, as I said, for the ABC, it's a responsibility and something we're really embracing. But for the commercials, news will always remain a big part of their mix.
And speaking of news, and also you mentioned Married at First Sight, I remember 2018 when you launched Married at First Sight, I think it was January or February that year, and it meant that show meant that during that year you actually knocked off Channel 7 in the ratings, and your market cap went above Fairfax's in the first half of that year for the first time, and then in the middle of that year you bought Fairfax because your market cap. So I actually thought that Married at First Sight enabled you to buy Fairfax. Did you see it that way at the time?
Well, certainly, as a board, we looked at the strength in the share price and realised that there was opportunities for our shareholders to look at transactions that might be value accretive, and I think in many ways the merger, I will call it, not an acquisition, worked really, really well in the long term because the newspaper business itself, I think, has turned out to be a better business than many people were giving it credit for at that time. Why? Because, the newspaper business has become a much more subscription-based environment. And there has been a propensity and a preparedness of people to pay for news. And so, again, it's just that transition, right? The old Fairfax titles, the Sydney Morning Herald, the Financial Review, certainly, the Age, those are titles that are growing in their subscription revenue line. There's still a transition away from advertising, but again, you can see the long-term tenure of those businesses. So I think that was about building a business that was not just, it's not about whether it's a broadcast business or it's a newspaper business. It was a content business, and it was a content business invested in content that would generate ad revenue and subscription revenue. And it was that focus on having a subscription revenue strength that was really the underpinnings for that merger.
Yeah, but Nine's share price then was $2.50. Now it's less than $1. So with the benefit of hindsight, was it a good idea to merge with Fairfax or take them over?
Yeah, look, I think there are all sorts of things. I won't get into individual decisions that might be driving that outcome, but I do feel there's a story to be told about where those businesses can grow and why they should be able to grow. And in this, very different environment to what it was 20 years ago, I think the data points to there's the potential for growth. It's control of the cost line that's important, and that competitive environment. And when you're 7, 9 and 10 and you're still bashing each other up on the cost line, like you're really driving the industry's own demise. They've got to work together and accept it's a new competitive landscape that they're operating in, and they've got to shift their focus to those new competitors.
Do you think the ABC needs some kind of Married at First Sight? I mean, I've never watched it, to be honest, but apparently it's very popular, as you said. Is that not the ABC's role in the media to come up with popular shows like that?
I think there's a recognition in the way the charter was created, which is to the extent that things are well serviced by the commercial media, the ABC should focus on other less served areas. So no, I don't think Married at First Sight is our ambition. Again, we're not a revenue-based organisation in that sense of, success falls or dies based on our ability to generate revenue from individual programs. I think we have to look at, again, distinctiveness, value and trust. They're the measures that we can sort of consider in our program mix. So yeah, I think the content that the ABC generates will always be in somewhat different to what a commercial organisation will do.
Do you think that because the ABC doesn't rely on advertising revenue, that it's better able to handle the transition? I think we sort of touched on this a bit. Better able to handle the transition from traditional media to whatever's coming?
I think our great advantage is we can be truly agnostic. So a viewer or a consumer of our content, our journalism or our entertainment content or our audio content we don't necessarily have a horse in the race of whether it's in our own platforms or whether it's on a third party platform. Our obligation is to inform Australians or to entertain Australians or educate them. So we can be agnostic of that and not have to worry about how we shift audience or how we embrace that audience shift from a revenue basis, which is a massive advantage for the ABC. But as you know, and working at the ABC, the great challenge that comes with that is often we just build extra platforms on top of what we already do, and we don't actually transition, we just add. And that creates an environment where our teams are stretched to do more because there are more platforms to occupy. So I think the challenge for me, specific to the ABC, is how do I look at solving that staff challenge to go, what are we going to prioritise on and what are we going to deprioritise? The same thing I was talking about with the commercial players to reflect, what we should be focusing on specifically for the future.
Yeah, so when you started and you looked at what the ABC does, just building on what you just said, did you think, well, there's a few things that were a mistake that the ABC has done and need to end in order to focus on the things that are important?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge is the ABC has trouble stopping things. Why? Because generally when we stop things, there are some people still rusted on to that particular program or format or particularly, platform sort of, the way that that's distributed. And so we react to the noise rather than saying, to the Australian audience, hey, this is where media is shifting. This is where the ABC needs to shift. We need to do that in a holistic, strategic way rather than pulling at individual threads all the time. And then we need to go out and sell that why to the stakeholders and to the public to say, hey, this is where we're going and why. And we're going to add these things and stop those things, and that's reflective of where the market is now. So we're working through that process at the moment, and I would suspect over the next year and a bit, you'll see us start to lean into the future of the ABC rather than the past. And I think that was the biggest thing for me arriving, was just seeing the pressure on all staff and how much they're being asked to do, and knowing that's the challenge to solve, and then thinking as well, what sorts of content do we do? And again, for the ABC, it's less volume, more distinctiveness is our future. It's the same sort of content challenge as the commercials face. Less volume, where you're filling slots and taking revenue by default. More distinctiveness means you've got to compete in a broader environment. That distinctive content maybe needs to be a different sort of thing to what we've done in the past. So that's the exercise for us.
Are you prepared to tell us what you think now needs to be stopped?
Well, I think, we have, again, we might be doing, I'll give you an example, a legacy television show that has been around for 40 years, that we still do it. There's still a lot of work that goes into it. All that work is valid and there's a lot of people working hard to do it. But that particular show may not be the sort of content that we want for the future. So, we're sitting here on a podcast that, behind someone who's got real expertise and audience engagement, maybe that sort of distinctive content is more the future rather than the schedule filler that we've always had, in the past. And I think I won't give specific examples because then there'll be teams that go, oh, what does that mean for me? But I think I've spoken about this challenge a lot, and everybody agrees with me. They all say, yes, Hugh, that's great. Say we're going to stop things, but nobody ever does that. So I think that's I think the employee base as a general rule gets this challenge and wants us to embrace it. So, we've got to go on and do it.
Yeah, well, the staff are pretty grumpy at the moment. They had a strike not long ago. I mean, is there some difference, do you think, between ABC staff and commercial TV staff?
Look, there's certainly a very high sense of purpose with ABC staff. They really feel the obligation to serve the public and the importance of that, and sometimes that sense of purpose will be very personal to them. I think in commercial businesses it's much easier to rally a staff mix around a KPI or a profit target or a shareholder value target or wherever it is. I think in the ABC, when it's much more based on individual purpose and sense of purpose, that means different things to different people. So that's part of the challenge. But I think as well, it's just, again, management hasn't solved the challenge that staff need us to solve, which is how do we take this much more complex environment where we have to, we used to be television and radio, then we're television, radio and digital. Now we're television, radio, digital and podcasting, television, radio, digital, podcasting and social. We've gone from 2 platforms to 5. We need to occupy in all of those places, and we've got the same staff level to do it. So, that has to change. And that drives, I think, a lot of expectation from staff, from management to make the right decisions to do that.
That 24-hour strike by the ABC staff got a lot of coverage everywhere. And you jumped on the ABC during the period and said the unions treated taking industrial action as a bit of a game. Was that a mistake?
It sort of felt to me going through the process, and obviously I was intimately involved, especially at the end, that to a degree it felt like the unions, it was almost like the strike was inevitable. And I thought the issues at hand were really important. So, it's just a question of how that plays out and what each individual stakeholder's, responsibility in that is. And as I said, when we spoke about this a bit, I think having been through that experience, we need to talk to all the different stakeholders and work out, okay, if we're going to, when we go through this again, is there a better way that we can do it so that we don't get into this thing where things feel inevitable, where we are all focused on the constructive outcome? There will always be tension just because of the nature of the negotiation. But yeah, I think that there's ways that we can all do things better, I think, in that mix.
Do you think you went into the negotiations too aggressively?
No, I think actually quite the opposite. I think we went into the negotiation in an environment where, in the general media mix, there's not a lot of pay rises going around generally in the media. Actually, there's a lot of jobs being lost in media. So, as the ABC, we have to be, I think, considerate of the total environment as well as the environment for our staff. So, no, I think we went in with what we thought was a fair offer. We didn't sort to start low to get beaten up high. We went in with what we thought was a fair and reasonable offer, reflecting all of those things and balancing staff interests and the interests of content and services. So, no, we certainly didn't go into that with an aggressive mindset.
And what about now? The interest rates are going up, inflation's a problem. Do you think you now understand the staff concerns a bit more?
Well, I always understood the staff concerns. The question is whether the ABC can solve all of those concerns. Unfortunately, I'm not in control of inflation. We have a limited budget. The budget goes up by a certain amount per year. Our budget goes up by less than inflation. So, again, if we're offering too much money in one place, that's going to impede in another, and ultimately either jobs or content and services. So, I think a recognition. My job is to balance all of those things and try and find the right outcomes. I think is really important.
And speaking of staff, when you started as CEO last March, the ABC was in court with Antoinette Lattouf, who was suing for unfair dismissal. And now she's on a book tour where she's got a bag of salt that she's rubbing into the ABC's wounds most days. So what did you learn about the ABC when you looked at that case, and what did you think of it?
Yeah, I mean, I've talked about this as well. There's a lot of fear inside the ABC, fear of making the wrong decision, and sometimes fear of making a wrong decision means you end up making the wrong decision for those fear purposes. And I think that was a reactive decision. It was a reactive decision to forces that we should not have been reactive to. I think we let down Antoinette, we let down the ABC, we let down the audience, and frankly, it was just a bad decision. It was also a bad decision that we should have rectified a lot faster than we did, which we didn't do as well. And a lot of that comes out, and I get this, right? We're constantly under pressure. There's a lot of public commentary about the ABC, as there should be. There's political pressure always on the ABC. There's a lot of extra pressure here that you don't get in other businesses, again, where a profit motive can provide that singular focusing force. So, that pressure does lead to more pressure on decisions, but we need to be brave enough to stick to our decisions and make the right one. I mean, Antoinette was on a 5-day contract, and we terminated after 3. There was 2 days to run. It was a reactive decision that was a complete mistake, and she suffered, and the ABC suffered, and I think it's a sorry affair.
Have you changed anything at the ABC to make sure that sort of thing doesn't happen again? That 2 days, that was amazing. That they whoever was in charge of that decision couldn't wait 2 days.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly have tried to clarify management decision making. Again, you don't want to have all decisions having to come up to the MD's office because I'm only one person, so I can't possibly operate in that environment. We do have to delegate, but just making sure that my team are aware that they're supported and that the environment is there for them to make the right decisions, not creating an environment where they're being forced to make the wrong decisions. And so that's something I've tried to do very early, and I think we've been successful at that.
How will you measure success at the ABC, your success? And will it be different, do you think, to the way your predecessors measured it?
Yeah, I think we spoke a little bit about when we started around, what might, and we're a content organization, right? That's what we do. I mean, people will say we're a broadcaster, we're a radio company, or a television company. I look at it and say we're a content organization. We do news content, current affairs, drama, entertainment, a whole bunch of different genres that we have to do to the public. So it'll be what's the success of that content. Now, part of that will be audience. What does our audience look like across all of those platforms? But part of it, and this is the challenge, I guess, to redefine is what does distinctiveness mean as we go forward? Now, you can measure that in a commercial business because distinctiveness drives a subscription decision. It drives a decision to say, I want to pay for that. We don't have that outcome. So it can't just be total audience. We need to look at things that maybe other businesses would look at as a reason to pay for that content. And we've got to do a lot better at that distinctiveness end of the spectrum. And so for me, trust, people's value of the ABC. I mean, we had a low around Antoinette Lattouf. We're now well back over 80% when we do our audience surveys for both those metrics. If I can keep those numbers up high and maybe even grow them a bit, that will be success, and it'll point to that, yes, I value the ABC. I believe that it's good value to the taxpayer. So I think that's the way that we will look at it. And yes, audience metrics will remain a relevant factor in how we look at that as well. So what's happening to our audience growth.
And do you have to make sure that those measurements are the same as the way that the people who provide the money in government also look at it? I mean, in that context, what do you think of the parliamentary committee hearings that you have to go through?
I mean, yes, I think telling our story is important. I think the ABC has traditionally not done, or not over the last, 10 years, done a great job of telling our story as to our values. So, we've got to do that well. And I think that distinctiveness thing is part of that. And I keep saying to people, I don't want people necessarily just to remember the ABC. I want them to remember the things that we do, that they can go back at any year and say, oh, yeah, they did that well. That was a great program. Oh, that audio platform is fantastic. The products are great. I want them to talk more about the things of the ABC rather than just the ABC. So that's number one. And that's, again, talking about distinctiveness. And when it comes to the parliament, I mean, that's the parliamentary process is the process. It's the process we have. It's something that we need to participate in. It can be, I think I called it the other day, a certain word which gave people a lot of laughs. It can be unpleasant, but it's necessary. And, that's part of my job is to go through that process and to tell the story of the ABC and our content in a way that, make sure that we're talking to the excellence of what we do and not talking to the mistakes that we make. And that, that's the exercise.
The history seems to be that whenever the coalition's in power, the budget gets cut, Labor comes back in, budget goes up. Is there any way you can change that cycle, do you think, by and sort of appealing more to the coalition in some way?
Oh, I don't think we need to appeal to the coalition, but we need to make sure that we're relevant to the stakeholders, so the voters who determine which party's in power, and that's about talking to all Australians. So, we need to make sure that we mean more to more Australians, that we don't lean into this notion that sometimes is here of the ABC audience. We need to talk to all Australians. Obviously, being reflective of what the ABC audience, wants and likes is important, but we need to make sure we're talking to all Australians and we're providing services that are valuable to all Australians. I mean, if you go to many of the coalition seats in regional Australia, sometimes we're going to be we already are, if we're not always at the moment, we will be maybe the last, substantial media player in many of those locations. But we need to make sure that we're delivering a service that people really value. And that needs to be, yes, emergency broadcasting is part of that, but daily habit of engaging with the ABC needs to be a big part of that. So we've really got to make sure that we're serving all audiences well and remove that question, because guess what? We're a value to people in all electorates. And that's the important thing I think we've got to really make work.
Do you think fighting with the union put you offside with the government to some extent? I mean, would it be better if you weren't doing that?
No, I didn't get any sense of that from the government. I mean, again, they would say it's a matter for the ABC. That's an important part of our independent charter. For me, that was really a step to say, you know what, I have various responsibilities as a leader of the ABC, and I've got to balance both my engagement with my staff, but weigh that with the services that we're able to provide to audiences. Ultimately, it's for me and the leadership team here to decide how we manage that balance. There will always be an inbuilt tension in that. And I think as long as people respect that's the process we go through the process and come out the other end, I think there are elements we always learn from having been through that process, how we can do it better and what the expectations of each participant in that process should be. But, I also have to consider, sustainability for our services, not just for our staff. So that's a balance.
I think one of the reasons the coalition tends to cut the ABC's budget and to basically criticise the ABC is because they think it's biased. Do you think it is? And, is there some sort of problem there?
No, we're certainly, we have high standards that talk to impartiality, and very rarely are we breached on impartiality standards. So I think the allegation of bias is not true. I think, we need to recognise in the media environment sometimes that there are people that don't like us to report facts or truth or viewpoints or perspectives that, might not be ABC perspectives, but perspectives of other people. And so there'll always be a bit of push and pull about what we report and why. And when people disagree with us, there may be views about that. I don't think there's great evidence that the ABC is biased. I think, we have very high standards. There are complaint mechanisms in place that people can go through when they assess that, believe that there's impartiality. And we've had very few breaches of impartiality. I would count them on one hand, I think, over the last few years. So I don't think that's true. I think there's two aspects to that. One is obviously sometimes our reporting will differ from maybe people's or viewers' perspectives, and that perspective shift on our content can sometimes create conflict. Someone has a perspective that the truth should be X. We're obviously trying to report a balance of perspectives that may not reflect that truth. So that sometimes creates a perception of bias, which is unfounded. And then I think, sometimes we can do a better job just of the range of stories and things that we cover, to make sure that we're talking about the things of importance to all Australians rather than maybe things that are considered to be important to a subset. So I think that's a constant exercise for us to make sure that we're focusing on all of the things that are important to Australia, and that will also contribute, I think, to perception on that issue.
You mentioned that the ABC is a content organisation, which it obviously is. Now, I'm not sure what happened with Bluey. Do you understand why the ABC doesn't own Bluey? Do you understand what happened? And do you have to make any changes to ensure that sort of thing doesn't happen again, that you don't lose those kind of very, very lucrative programs?
Yeah, I mean, they turned out to be lucrative. Not necessarily easy to see that when you're looking at the original proposition. So we are assessing this question through hindsight. But what happens with the financing of many of these programs, the entertainment side of the business, is often there's a finance plan, and there'll be, a component that the ABC provides. There'll be a component that, is, funded by tax credits from, the public. And then there'll be a component that is often, assessed against international markets. So if you like, that's a syndication of what the future royalty streams might be, an estimation of that. And a party comes in and takes that risk that those income streams will happen or won't. So in the case of Bluey, there would have been a part of the budget that would have been, there to be financed by someone who was going to take the international rights. Now, the ABC decided not to take that risk, and the BBC decided to take that risk. I think it's also fair to say that maybe the BBC is better positioned to exploit those rights than the ABC was at the time. So I think capability was another a question that was relevant to that. But the risk, in a sense, in terms of the total budget of the ABC, was not a huge sum of money. I think it was something like $2 million on the first season. So, for me, I guess having come from my background, I'm in a good position to be able to assist the ABC on our estimation of where are the risks and what is the respective likelihood of, where is it the right place to take risk and where is it perhaps places we shouldn't take risk, and to really reframe what the ABC's attitude is to risk on that sort of investment, so that in the future, where we are making those investments or various programs and there are investments there to be made, the ABC should, as a function, become a little bit more commercial and say, what, for the benefit of the taxpayer, we should take risks in these areas and be prepared to do that and for that to be part of the activity. So I think, yes, we will certainly reframe how we look at that going forward. I understand why the decision was made at the time. In hindsight, it's turned out to be not the right decision. But it's hard to judge without knowing the circumstances of what was going on inside the ABC at the time that decision was made.
In fact, your first CEO job was in charge of a production company, Southern Star Group, wasn't it? I mean, did that experience put you in a better position, do you think, to be able to assess those kind of risks?
Yeah, well, absolutely. My first job actually in media when I joined Channel 9 was to look at the financing for an old television show called Water Rats. You may remember it.
I do.
And Southern Star at the time, it took a huge amount of risk on that show to co-finance that with Nine, and Nine in return committed to do a number of episodes. So that was a financing model that exists. That financing model actually got Southern Star into trouble at the time because the risk was so large, and it was such a good program that Nine just kept ordering more series, and so Southern Star's risk went up and up and up. Now, in hindsight, and again, this is the advantage of being a corporation like the ABC as opposed to a smaller business like Southern Star, that risk actually paid dividends, and that show went into profit, and the money was all recovered by Southern Star. It was just over a longer period than they hoped at the time. So again, the ABC is in a good position as a government institution to be able to take on some of those risks, and I think we need to for the benefit of the industry. So it's certainly something that we need to look at doing more of.
Yeah, do you think that'll actually characterise your leadership at the ABC in a way that didn't characterise your predecessors?
I think, again, for the ABC, a bit like a commercial business, I've got to look at what our total funding base is. And if we're successful in generating some royalty or some increase in royalty income to the ABC, that will come into the funding base, enable us to do more content, deliver more services to the public. So, yeah, I think that's another opportunity for us as an organisation to be able to deliver more benefit to the public. So it's something that we need to look at.
Just finally, I want to talk about AI. I'm seeing a lot of videos, very, very good videos created by AI, including of me, among other things. But do you think we'll ever get to the point where when we turn on the news, there's an AI thing reading the news at us?
I don't think so. No, I think, again, AI is good at learning of what's been done in the past. Yes, it can be a bit predictive, but I think that still requires work of journalism to actually identify a story, find out something that people want to talk about, and then be able to do that in a way that's not informed by the past, that's informed by that individual story. So I think AI will be a tool for organisations like the ABC. It should enable us to be more efficient. It should enable productivity. It should partly solve the challenge that I've talked about for staff of how do we do more with no more resources. And that's a huge challenge for the ABC. The pressure on us is significant. So it should be a good tool in that mix. It will enable us to do individual things. There's a radio presenter we have as part of the regional group who has Parkinson's. So I'm talking to her about using AI, so maybe, you know, we can extend her career on air by using her voice, but again, still having her, you know, enter the data that would be relevant to what she would present. So there's a lot of actually great tools and use cases when I look at it. And I just know from our own organization, we're going to have to provide a tool for all staff. We're going to have to pay for it because we need it in a paid environment, not sort of the less secure free environment. So, you know, it's going to be a shift in cost base, and that's something that all organisations are facing. But you know, we need to look at it as a tool that we can use for the purposes of our products and services, not a replacement for the storytelling capacity that should remain individual led.
Right, but that's the ABC. What about the industry more generally? I mean, how widely, how much do you think AI is going to be used in the media?
I think it'll be used widely, but will it completely devastate employment? I don't think so. I think I don't know that we'll ever get to a stage where an AI-generated news bulletin can be as effective as a human originated and controlled bulletin. It just can't. It can't do local very well. It can't do predictive storytelling well. It can't identify story themes very well. I mean, it can do all of those things, but just not as well as I think experience and human-led activity can do. So it's a tool for us to use, not a replacement.
Thanks for talking to us, Hugh Marks.
Thanks, Alan. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much for joining me on That's Business. You can find That's Business on the ABC Business Daily feed every Friday. So you don't miss out, make sure you follow ABC Business Daily to find us on ABC Listen and wherever you get your podcasts. And tell your friends about us. That's the best way to help us grow. Carrington Clark and the ABC Business Daily team will be back in the feed on Monday.